Hi friends, and welcome back to Raft. A while ago, I published this video explaining the story behind our favorite ocean survival simulator. And while that's a great video that I highly recommend you check out if you haven't already, it was more meant to be a general outline of the story to make it easier to comprehend, as the details are all spread out through a series of notes at the various story locations. Also, a lot of what I talk about in this video won't make as much sense if you don't know the gist of the story overall, so check that one out first. The problem is that in my general outline of the story, I didn't really cover just how truly dark the story is, and how horrible the situations that you encounter at each location really are. In my opinion, each location is darker than the last, culminating in some details in Tangaroa that are truly horrifying. So today, we're going to discuss all of those details. But first, this video obviously contains spoilers. If you don't want to view the story locations, or if you don't want to know the lore behind them, then this video isn't for you, so here's another one I'd recommend instead. Also, the devs have confirmed that the story will change slightly with the arrival of Chapter 3. Supposedly, it's just going to be a simpler version of all of the same events, just removing some of the minor characters to make things a bit more understandable. So pretty much everything I cover in this video should be the same, but in case it isn't, that's why. If you want to see an updated version of this once Chapter 3 releases, be sure to let me know and consider subscribing so you can see it when it comes out. But without further ado, let's get into the really dark parts of Raft's story. As the game currently exists, you never interact with another living human being. Your only source of information is these little notes that they have left behind. The first place you encounter these notes is at the radio tower, the first story location. As we know, there were 4 engineers working on a nearby nuclear reactor platform. The group's employers were angry at the engineers because they weren't working as hard as they could be in some very unsafe conditions, and it's implied that one of the engineers who was part of the previous team tipped off the shady employers to the other engineers slacking on the job. The scary part is, once the employers came to get the reactors to take them to higher ground, they flat out abandoned half of their engineers on the reactor platform, fully anticipating that they would sink with the platform when the waters rose too high. That's some James Bond level evil. But those 2 did make it to the radio tower, but were further stranded without food or a functioning boat to even attempt to survive. The part about this that trips me up is the engineer who supposedly worked on the previous team, but he wouldn't talk about it with his coworkers. We assume he's tipping off the evil employers, who literally abandoned half of their crew to drown, so that certainly doesn't bode well for that previous team. I think it's safe to say that we would never find that team alive, and we know that the same engineer who tipped off the employers was later found floating by members from the cruise ship, so they even abandoned him when he was no longer useful. Corporate greed is one terrible thing, but leaving people to drown and having a whole team unaccounted for is a whole different level of purely messed up. But in comparison to the other story locations, the radio tower is by far one of the most tame, and that should tell you something about where we're headed. The cruise ship is a huge yacht infested with giant mutated rats that we know was abandoned following the captain's death. If you were paying attention, you'll know that the captain got tetanus from one of the cook's knives, ending up with lockjaw. The captain died a horrible, painful, and slow death. Tetanus starts with fever, difficulty eating, and some painful muscle stiffness. It only gets worse with lockjaw, where the muscles of your jaw literally lock shut. So much for eating, drinking, or speaking. You'll starve to death, or your body will simply shut down, but it's definitely not an easy way to go. In the midst of the captain's own tragedy, they're dealing with a politician who still wants to be in control after abandoning his own people, waving around a gun, and their ship is full of holes and infested with rats that will attack you on sight. Half of the crew took the lifeboat with that politician, leaving at least a few crew members behind. There's no bodies anywhere, but with some healthy rats, I think we can guess what happened, and it's certainly not great. Kind of like the cruise ship, Balboa Island tells a story of individual tragedy. We know that Bruno Correa was left alone on the island when his wife answered a distress call, and we can watch Bruno's descent into madness over a few journal entries. To get over his loneliness, Bruno invents children out of scrap, giving them their own thoughts and ideas and interactions. Again, these are made from scraps, and frankly, they're pretty terrifying on their own. But what's more is that Bruno's narratives didn't just stop at simple sibling fights. They escalated to his own imagined murder. Bruno left the island at some point in an auxiliary boat, but could only take one of his so-called children with him. His triplets were apparently so jealous of one of the other made-up children that they thought would be selected for this. You can find him outside the ranger station, literally missing his makeshift head, which you can later find in this cluster of other children when exploring the island. That's right, Bruno was so crazy by the time that he left that not only had he made up these creepy childlike statues and given them imaginary life, but then he had them murder his other creations. And he did take one of the children with him when he left the island, so Bruno was full-blown insane and imagined the murder of the very things that he invented to get over his own loneliness. But it only goes downhill from here. Caravan Town is the first place we see tragedy on a wider scale. Multiple people were literally cut off from the rest of the island when the salmonella outbreak became too serious to control, severing the bridge that connected them to the main island. Presumably, those people died without access to antibiotics, food, or water. Among them was the town doctor, who was severely infected himself after treating as many as he could. But before its downfall, Caravan Town was a thriving hub for those who could survive on the water, but with a catch. Only those with skills useful to the island were allowed to remain. That means that anyone deemed unworthy of the island's resources were simply turned away, left to drift on an endless ocean. And we know that there's not a lot of other civilizations out there to take them in, so if they don't already have the skills to survive on their own, they're pretty much screwed. And one of the main characters we hear from in Caravan Town is a child scientist who was allowed to remain simply because his mother and father were useful. Which means that if this kid didn't prove themselves useful, they would be abandoned by the town as soon as they were old enough. But the salmonella outbreak forced the town's hand before they could even address that concern. Everyone had to leave, but their story doesn't end with Caravan Town itself. Things take a turn for the drastically worse with Tangaroa. We know that the rafters from Caravan Town did make it to Tangaroa only to be denied entry. And to make matters worse, the captain of Tangaroa, James Tully, didn't just say no. He ordered his security team to fire their weapons at the rafters with the intent to wound them. Keep in mind that the town doctor was already long gone from that salmonella outbreak, so these people are starved and grieving after having to abandon the life that they had built for themselves and those people that they lost to the outbreak, only to be shot at when they saw a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. Frankly, we don't know if the rafters survived, which is almost worse. Tully made the decision to open fire on the rafters due to Tangaroa's own struggles. Their food source was infested with beetles, leaving a dwindling food supply, and the engines were starting to get clogged up with beetle guts, so their floating city is shutting down. Things are so desperate that the captain demands that all of the pets be rounded up so that the people of Tangaroa wouldn't eat their small companions when food became too scarce. The state of desperation you would need to be in to even consider eating your pet is unimaginable, and these people had no other options. Even Tangaroa, which is supposed to be this source of hope and survival on this ocean, had to be abandoned, leaving no signs of life behind. On that very depressing note, that's where the story currently ends. We know that there will be more coming with Chapter 3, but until then, we're left with this incredibly grim view of what the world has come to, and we still haven't seen a single person. Although I have a sneaking suspicion we'll learn more about the people from the radio tower and Tangaroa in Chapter 3. So keep a lookout for a video coming soon on what I think Chapter 3's story will be. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, even though this wasn't the most fun video ever. I hope you enjoyed. Please consider leaving a like if you did, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. And as always, have a great day.